It's my pleasure to introduce John Lechleiter, Chairman of Eli Lilly. So I'm going to be asking a few questions of John over the next 20 minutes or so about his career, long career at Lilly. He's recently retired as President and CEO, a position he held since 2008, having worked his way up through the company since 1979. Starting as a chemist, throughout his time at Lilly, he's taken on roles in R&D, project management, regulatory affairs, product development, pharma operations, and then becoming the CEO. I just want to say on behalf, I think, really of the sort of Alzheimer's community, a big thanks to Lilly for their investment and commitment to Alzheimer's research over many, many years, and for being so open and transparent in terms of how they've shared and presented their data. Alzheimer's Research UK convened a meeting of leading scientists earlier on this year, and Lilly presented a lot of the data from their recent phase 3 trial. So I think it's a real example to the field in terms of actually sharing data, allowing the field to scrutinise their data and significantly learn from the investment that Lilly have made. So it's a great example, and I do hope others follow. John, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to chat to you today, and I'm really pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to have a seat because I am 9 months pregnant, and this is my last event. So I'm pleased that I've actually made it here today. So, John, you've been at Lilly since 1979 and led the company for nearly 10 years. You've been really key to Lilly's commitment to Alzheimer's disease, and it's been probably a long and maybe bumpy road. What has it been like from your point of view?
Well, it has been a long and bumpy road. We reckon our first serious effort in Alzheimer's goes back to the late 1980s. Steve Paul is here somewhere. Steve was instrumental in sort of continuing that through the last decade. As someone commented before, we think we spent around $3 billion or so when you look at the preclinical and clinical research. So why do we persist? Well, I think in the process of all these failures, we've accumulated a lot of knowledge. I believe we have among our scientists and physicians some of the most capable and knowledgeable people anywhere who have also persisted and stayed with it. And of course, we've had the opportunity to work with so many of the people in this room, some incredible collaborators on what initially felt like a sort of a lonely journey in a way when we started our 2 phase 3 programs in the last decade. Semagacistat, our oral gamma secretase inhibitor, that trial was discontinued in 2010. And then solanezumab, our antibody, were the first 2 trials, Expedition 2, read out in 2012, and then more recently Expedition 3 last November. So I think this is what major pharmaceutical companies, this is the type of area we should be working in. I think it's, to me, a bit akin to the work we did in diabetes with Banning and Best back in the 1920s, not recognizing then that the problem of diabetes would become so prevalent as it is today. We know from demographics where we're going with Alzheimer's. They say the only things that are certain are death and taxes. I think demographic trends have to be sort of third on that list because barring some global cataclysm, we sort of know the shape of the curve as we move ahead. And what we all describe today as a major issue and a major health challenge of our time is going to be magnified 25 years hence. We know that. So all of those things, I think convince us to carry on. And the availability of targets. There's more than one target. Amyloid itself is very complex, so there's multiple approaches, I think, being taken there. And I'm encouraged also the last discussion about diagnostics. We need better and improved diagnostics. We have to be working on a few of those, but what we really need are surrogate biomarkers. We have to find ways to begin to tackle this disease earlier in its evolution, and I think the only way to do that is by having biomarkers that we can use reliably to hopefully help us predict the course of the disease.
And so what do you think has been learnt from the recent trial failures of solanezumab?
Well, I think, when you look at the data, and we shared the data quite widely, as you point out, it's hard to look at that data, I'll just say, and sort of say, well, there's nothing happening there, okay? Yes, we missed our endpoints, but I think there are some tantalizing pieces to that data that, and other, other molecules from other companies represented here have shown some encouraging data. So, I've always said to people at Lilly, I feel like we're hot on the trail. There's a what's the game show in the U.S., Wheel of Fortune, where they put the puzzle pieces up, and if you put enough puzzle pieces together, eventually you spell you can sort of see what the word is. I feel like we're putting more pieces up on the board day by day, year by year. I'm actually optimistic that we will be able to achieve the 2025 goal despite the setbacks. I think there's some other things. I mean, there's a huge amount we can learn from failed studies even. And during my time as CEO, I've got to be careful because I'm no longer leading the company. I encouraged us to be as open as we could be with that data. I think the field benefits, everybody benefits when we all understand better what we can learn from these trials. Our phase 3 database is the largest in the world. I mean, we have more, curated patient years of data in those 3 trials, and hopefully someday we'll be surpassed, or we'll surpass that ourselves. But I think that's a big resource for the field, and I think within the boundaries that we operate in, when you consider the regulatory aspects and intellectual property and all of that, we want to be as open as we can be. I think the other thing is, I think we've learned a lot about how to do these studies. We don't talk much about that, but particularly when you're treating moderate patients that are further along in disease progression, you're asking them to have a PET scan, several PET scans, and you're asking them to stay faithful to an 18-month sort of treatment cycle. Eric Seamers told me the other day that 85% of the patients who enrolled in Expedition 3 completed the 18-month treatment period. And we're all sort of learning this together, but we want to be able to do these trials well. At the same time, we'd like to be able to do these trials earlier and before symptoms emerge even. I think ultimately that's kind of where we want to get to.
Absolutely. So in recent years, there's been a concerted global effort following on from the G7. You mentioned the 2025 target that was set by the G7 here in London a few years ago, and spearheaded by Alzheimer's Research UK's new president, David Cameron, when he was the Prime Minister. What sort of changes have you seen in the external environment from Lilly's perspective sort of in recent years, and how has that maybe helped?
Well, I think the UK, the government here, and the so many people in this room deserve a tremendous amount of credit, because I think this country has been a global leader in terms of not only raising awareness, but sort of putting its money where its mouth is. I think we're seeing greater levels of awareness everywhere. I think that's a function of demographics and the fact that more registered voters are worried about this this problem, whether it's them or as caregivers for elderly parents. And I think that we are making progress. And I think in a document you produced, you noted that in the last 3 years we've seen a doubling in the number of phase 1 to phase 3 trials looking at therapeutic interventions, but that total's only 150.
Yep.
And we have 17,000 studies going on that we count in the same way for cancer, for example. So without trying to discourage anyone, I would say the work we're doing together in neurodegeneration is rather in its infancy compared to the way the pharmaceutical industry has moved through cardiovascular disease and cancer. But when you read The Emperor of All Maladies and sort of called the biography of cancer, I was surprised, on the other hand, to learn that modern chemotherapy is really a fairly new thing. That cancer in the 60s or even the 70s, we had 1 or 2 chemotherapeutic tools. For the most part, the advances have come in the 80s and the 90s, and and in the aughts. So, I think we've got to get more money into basic research here. Many of you know, because many of you work in industry or been affiliated with industry, there's a fairly limited amount of research we can afford to do. I mean, most of that R&D is D. And one of the reasons for that is development has become so expensive in terms of numbers of patients we have to study, numbers of clinical endpoints we need to measure. So we rely on the broad community, on government-funded research, whether it's the NIH, the MRC, you name it. We rely on collaborations with academic scientists to sort of fill out the space. And we need more fundamental research done in this area. We need to better understand, as people were saying this morning, the etiology and the pathology of the disease. I mean, as a non-scientist who's sort of been watching this as CEO, as all of this work took place within our company, I'm sort of amazed at some of the basic questions we don't know the answers to in terms of what precedes what, and what's an artifact versus what is implicated in causality. I mean, these are big questions, and obviously that information is only going to be revealed through careful patient research over time. But my sense is we need to speed that up.
And I guess, there's been a number of initiatives, and we've heard about some earlier this morning, so the Dementia Discovery Fund that was initiated after the G7, which we're a part of, the Dementia Research Institute that's been recently launched in the UK. How important are these kind of initiatives in terms of providing the funding and collaboration, but also how are they important particularly for pharmaceutical companies in terms of ensuring there's that investment in basic research and that we're then translating that through?
Well, I think they're exceedingly important, and I think it's interesting to me to see just how innovative we've been, we collectively, this community, in terms of thinking about new ways to spread risk, as David said this morning, and to pool knowledge and resources. I think this is, if we're successful in 2025, I think we'll look back, or if we feel like we're at the beginning of being able to effectively treat or slow down the progression of the disease in 2025, I think we'll look back and say that much of the progress was due to some extraordinary partnerships. And while I think we have examples of those today, we have examples of collaborative efforts in multiple geographies, many of whom are represented here, I think we need to challenge ourselves. Are there other ways that we can collaborate? Are there paradigms we should shatter here, given that this is the only major cause of death, as I understand it, where mortality rates are not declining. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean this is it. This is the real moonshot, I think, that we're looking at here, and I think rather than believe we can tackle that through our individual efforts or through one company's efforts, I think we have to be more willing maybe than we've been in the past, and I'll say the industry as I say this, to share information, to collaborate, and to break down barriers that might have seemed nonsensical 10 years ago.
And what sort of are the things that you sort of reflect on now that you think that we should be doing as a sort of collective? Do you think there are sort of gaps in the way that we're working? I mean, I think there are some really fantastic partnership models out there in terms of how charities, government funders and pharma are then working together, but are there things that you think we should be doing more of? Is that sort of for you a real area of...
Well, I think aggregating risk capital, and I think we participated in the Discovery Fund along with I think 5 other pharmaceutical companies. It's interesting from a one company perspective what investors' views of this are, and I think we did a good job of setting the right kind of expectations as E3 Expedition 3 progressed. And I think the investment community, people had their own views. Some saw it as tremendous upside for the company. Others didn't even factor it into, anything going forward. But I think, an individual company is going to be challenged to have a portfolio balance that lets their investors understand that it's not all a big bet on one therapeutic area, which has been nothing but failures so far, okay? So we have a diabetes business, we have autoimmune, some drugs for autoimmune. You know, we have a broader base than that, obviously, and I think that pays the bills, right? I mean, that basically gives us the growth that investors are looking for and allows us to still invest robustly in R&D. But I think that, you know, fundamentally for any of us, any of the companies represented here who are currently investing in Alzheimer's research, I think we all have to have a modicum of courage because there are going to be critics and detractors. It wasn't, you know, it was about 19 or 20 months ago that I heard serious investors say to me that they thought Valiant, that was the new model. By the way, their shares were 264 or whatever the number was, and today it's $10 or $11. But I mean, I had people who followed this industry for a long time challenging me, why are you spending so much on R&D? Most of it's been wasted. Okay, I mean, real serious people saying that, okay? You know, and everybody's going to have a view on that. But I think that we have to muster the courage to continue a robust investment in R&D. And I say that not because I like spending money or because I think R&D is somehow good in its own sense, but because I think we have palpable leads and good reasons to make these investments. Now, having said that, I think we should also challenge ourselves around the whole concept of how we do some of these trials and how we maybe do drug development in general. I mean, when I joined Lilly as a chemist in 1979, it took 10 to 15 years to go from, I'll say, biological insight to something in the pharmacy shelf. Today, it takes 10 to 15 years to go from biological insight to something on the pharmacy shelf. So why do we accept that? We don't accept that anywhere else in terms of what you might call productivity. And I think for that to change, one company can't sort of say, we're going to get really good at development, and we're going to reduce that down to 5 or 6 years. I mean, in some cases you can, in some cases it's been done less than that. It's going to take the whole community, the regulators, the public, you know, there's always a risk-benefit to dramatically accelerate progress there. So I think we have to be, as leaders of the enterprises that are doing development work, we have to be challenging our folks to really think hard about that. And nowhere would it apply more than Alzheimer's. I mean, we stopped Expedition 2 in the summer of 2012, and it was 4 years and some months later before we had the next iteration of data from Expedition 3, and that was basically, you know, almost built on the first template. It wasn't like we had to design a new trial, but you just look at, somebody said earlier today, it takes us longer to enroll patients in many cases than it does in that treatment period. How do we address that? It's going to take more than just Lilly's efforts to do that, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess from your perspective, I mean, there are a number of different challenges that we're all aware of, but are there particular things and messages, I guess, for the field in terms of areas you think we should be focused on what the sort of new areas, sort of exciting areas of science are? And I guess there's sort of new areas of science, but there's also the sort of way that we do things.
Yeah, well, I think I've heard different numbers already this morning in terms of what the potential target universe might look like here. We always need new targets. I think we need better diagnostic tools and a way to, as I said earlier, to use these tools to help us begin the thought process around surrogate biomarkers. You know, clearly, you know, there's the beta amyloid piece of the picture. Amyloid biology is very complex. So, I mean, I think there's various facets and ways of approaching that are represented here in this room that you know, I don't think that the amyloid hypothesis is dead. I don't think we've proven it's viable either, but certainly, you know, our efforts are there in tau, in one or two other areas that relate to symptomatics. So, you know, I don't think this is a case where we're searching for a target or where we don't understand what those targets could be. I think, as we think about this at Lilly, I think the biggest question is when do you have to intervene, and how do you move this work earlier? We're participating in some studies that aim to look at that, but I think that's the one of our main areas of focus. But I remain very optimistic. I mean, I think that nothing's ever easy, but as I say, I think we're putting more pieces of that puzzle together, and I think if we can all try to collectively learn to look at that puzzle, through our own lens, but to harness that data, we will make progress.
And I think in terms of how we think about the disease, and one of the things that actually has been talked about is Alzheimer's disease and other dementias being a disease of midlife rather than a disease of later life. And actually, I think that starts to sort of shift that paradigm in terms of how the public and all of us think about the disease. And I think that's something, again, in terms of going earlier, which I think is something that may shift that sort of paradigm in terms of how we all look at the disease, but also in terms of how we treat it.
Yeah, I mean, none of us would think, none of us think of statins as useful after we had our first heart attack, right? I mean, many of us are prescribed statins because fairly early on, our physicians believe that lowering LDL is going to ultimately play out in better outcomes. So there are analogies for this. I don't, very few people who get statins when they're in their 20s or 30s are symptomatic. So it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it is one.
Sure. So moving to talk about sort of Lilly's investment in the UK. So this year is the 50th anniversary of research and development at Lilly's Uckwood facility. What does the next sort of 50 years hold for Lilly, the UK, for the Uckwood site?
Well, I have a certain fondness for that site because I worked there for 3 years in the early 80s. We have about 600 people in Windlesham today, and still the largest single pharmaceutical product in our history, olanzapine or Zyprexa, was discovered there. Today the focus is neuroscience, the focus of the basic research efforts there, neurodegeneration in particular, some work on symptomatics, some work on tau. We have a terrific team, Mike Hutton's here, and others there. So, yes, we're interested in all the aftermath of Brexit and all of that, but our commitment to the UK is intact.
That's good. So, having recently retired as CEO, and I know stepping down as chairman at the end of May, what are your reflections if you look back over your career? What are the particular things that you're most proud of?
Well, I think I'm quite proud of what this industry has accomplished in the time that I've been there. H2 antagonists and statins and new Prozac and lots of things that have come along the way. But I think the lessons learned for me, as it were, is that I think as CEOs in companies in this space that have a commitment to R&D, we have to be able to take a long-term view. Fortunately, the folks at BlackRock and a few other the big investors are also saying that companies should take a long-term view, but there's no long-term without a short-term. So I think you've always got to balance the, what are the demands of your shareholders and stakeholders today versus just keeping that continuity. I mean, we've been working in diabetes research now for about 100 years. We've been working in Alzheimer's for 30 years. Neuroscience in particular, probably back starting in the late 50s, if you kind of run that thread. So I think that the kinds of problems we're trying to tackle require a long-term focus, patient investment, and a willingness to invest. If you can do R&D on the cheap, somebody would have figured out how to do that. Nobody's figured out how to do that. And then this focus I talked about on productivity. How can we do what we do better, faster, less expensively without compromising patient safety to get medicines to people who need them faster. So, I think that turned out to be a good formula for Lilly. When I became CEO, we had patent expirations facing us. We lost essentially 40% of our 2009 revenue in a 2.5-year period between 11 and 14, but we've been able to restock the pipeline and keep investor confidence because of the investment in R&D, not because we pulled a rabbit out of a hat.
And so just finally, what would your parting message be to all of us working in the Alzheimer's disease and dementia field?
I think we need to keep the faith. I think we need to try to build on the learnings that we collectively gain as a research community. I think we need to decide that we want to make our work in this field a testament to an extraordinary new way of working together. That we have a clear goal that's been articulated. I think we have some tremendous consensus among governments, academic labs, and industry in terms of the compelling medical need and the importance of investing in the science. And I think we need to persevere. And nothing has ever come easy in biomedicine. And I think we need to keep in perspective where this field is relative to other areas that we've tackled over time, not solved, cardiovascular disease, cancer, for example, but made huge inroads into.
Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and
Thanks, Hilary.
thank you for your leadership in the field.
Thank you.